This series of the 50 Faces podcast is proudly brought to you by B Finance, a trusted partner to the world's leading institutional investors. With a proven track record in strategy, implementation, and oversight, B Finance delivers bespoke investment consultancy that empowers asset owners to achieve their unique objectives. Whether it's refining portfolio strategy, selecting fund managers, monitoring performance, or getting better value for money, B Finance combines global expertise with tailored solutions to unlock value for their clients. To learn more about how they've supported over 500 clients in 45 countries, managing assets totaling over $9 trillion, visit bfinance.com. Our next guest started his career in the US military and then became the head of a startup sovereign wealth fund. Hear from him how the Fondo Ahorro de Panama has grown from a startup into a confident, bold adolescent. I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, a podcast committed to revealing the richness and diversity of the world of investment by focusing on its people and their stories. I'm joined today by Abdiel Santiago, who is Secretary of the Fondo de Ahorro de Panama, a role he's held for over 11 years. He holds a number of board roles in addition, including Advisory Committee member of the Export-Import Bank of the US, a Board Advisory Committee member of the International Forum of Sovereign Wealth Funds, and a committee member of the Milken Institute. He's also a board leadership fellow at the National Association of Corporate Directors. Welcome, Abdiel. Thanks for joining me today.
Oh, hi, Ethan. Thanks a lot for the invitation. Happy to be here.
Well, let's start a little bit with your journey into finance, where you were born, what you studied, and how you came to enter this world.
Sure, certainly. I can say with certainty that my career path to managing a sovereign wealth fund for the finance industry, is anything but straightforward. It's been kind of unconventional. Beginning with where I was born. I was born and raised in Panama. My father served in the U.S. Army. My mother worked in the pharmacy division of Panama's Social Security office, a job that she still holds to this day at about 73 years old. I'm sure she would be too happy me disclosing her age, but that really, for me, is the source of strong work ethic. Growing up in the military bases in Panama, and attended the school there. And again, this is during the time where the military was in Panama, safeguarding the Panama Canal, which obviously has been in the news of late. And so there came a time for my dad to move from Panama to the US, and I came with him. This is my senior year in high school. And I had a choice to make. I wanted to go to college. Money was a little bit tight. So I decided to join the military as well. I joined the Air Force. He was in the Army. I joined the Air Force. There's a little bit of a rivalry there. But that, to me, was a very, very formative experience because it provided me with a strong sense of discipline, purpose, and resilience. So I did that for about 3 to 4 years. I was even shipped over to the Middle East to help with Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm. Some of your older listeners, I think, would appreciate that and would remember that. Obviously, I got to see a very different part of the world that I had no knowledge of. But at the end of the day, the military for me was a stepping stone to what I was really looking for, which was a university education. I attended the University of Denver, studied finance and business. In my studies, I had the opportunity to work with a finance professor and do some research on capital raisings of corporation, basically investment banking. So this is a paper that I did for the class for him. And that really, really opened my eyes to this industry that I knew nothing about. There was a certain allure of the industry, the excitement, the speed, what looked to be something extremely challenging from a mental and from a educational standpoint. And for me, it immediately clicked. I think this is something that I really wanted to do. Of course, some of the allure, I think you would agree, were superficial, the double-breasted suits and the nice shoes and all these kinds of things. But there was still, nevertheless, a little bit of the part that was attractive. So that basically set me off on a journey into the finance world.
Can I just begin there? I love that story and tracing it from the military too, because one of the areas certainly we are looking into leadership lessons. We look to a lot of military leaders. There seems to be quite a lot of lessons that are translatable from the military into corporate life. And I know you mentioned resilience, perhaps team building. I'd love to know, if you, in a nutshell, like what you think that military experience you bring with you into corporate life.
Sure, yes. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I think you see a lot of current CEOs or board members and people in very important roles. A good number of them do have military experience. I think there's a lot of factors, but I think one or two are basically the chain of command. Focusing on the chain of command allows for a sense of purpose, that the goal or the mission is more important than one individual person. I think what's interesting is with the chain of command purpose, that if you kind of translate that to business, it doesn't really translate exactly, because sometimes in business, you do kind of have to be creative, or you do kind of have to go around someone. So that is a very interesting dynamic, but nevertheless is very important to utilizing that experience in the corporate world. I would say, and you mentioned it, the teamwork aspect, which is, again, they're very tied. It's about focusing on the mission, focusing on what it is that it needs to be done, and making sure that everyone is clear as to what needs to be done. And every particular person that is in a team knows exactly what to do to achieve that mission. So that one translates, I think, much more clearly into the corporate world.
Moving forward then into your financial career, you found the allure. You maybe knew that some of it was a fake allure, but you nonetheless got into the real world of finance. Can you take us through then what your path was to the Sovereign Wealth Fund?
Right. Again, it was a long path. What I realized when I finished my university degree was that to get to that world, the capital raising world, the investment banking world, the M&A world, it would require a little bit something more than just a university degree. And the way that I saw that, or the way that I would solve for that, would be to get unique experiences. And so one of the unique experiences that I first obtained was joining the Securities and Exchange Commission in the United States. That's basically the securities or the capital markets regulator. And that provided an incredible wealth of knowledge because, number one, it allowed me to understand the inner workings of the finance industry, the accounting of financial firms, broker dealers. It allowed me to lead teams that were frankly even more experienced than I was. And having that military experience, also helped. And I would say it instilled in me a pretty strong sense of ethics, knowing the legal parameters of things, of decision making, from something very simple as how do you treat your customer in a brokerage situation with, again, the underlying accounting. Are the calculations correct for, say, the reserve requirements that some of the financial firms must have? So, very broad, wide, but also deep. And I would say that experience really differentiated myself. And to go back to the answer about, I knew that the university degree was not enough to make that jump into the financial world. In between was an MBA. And the MBA really provided that springboard, not only, great friendships that I still rely on to this day, a network, but also it was able to open doors that I didn't have before. And so that experience, that education, those contacts, that network, and obviously the professors were pretty instrumental as well, allowed me to jump into the finance world, did a couple of internships in investment banking and M&A, and then from a full-time perspective, joined the equity research team at Morgan Stanley. And that was a phenomenal experience because, really, I think, hit my stride. My ability to write, which is something that I think is very crucial, but not only write, but write financial reports, which are a little bit different than normal writing. The ability to distill complex ideas into graphs, and then obviously provide clients, in this case, it was hedge funds and these kinds of players, provide them with actionable ideas about a certain stock. In that role, I covered a wide range of industrial companies, from oil services to shipping to oil and gas, E&P or exploration and production companies, mining, and that kind of equities. But anyways, that was basically how I transitioned into the finance world. And in that process, I moved over to work in a restructuring environment. So I worked for a company out of Boston that did restructuring. That was interesting because it was the sort of job that it was very financially oriented, but the goal or the idea there was to help companies get out of trouble because obviously they were in financial distress, usually small to medium sized companies. And that was great. In that role, I did hear rumor that Panama was on the verge of creating a sovereign fund. And so I did a little digging and made a few contacts. And then I got a call from a headhunter asking me if I was interested in doing that kind of job. And what's interesting, I think, and for those of us that emigrate to a place like the United States, which is obviously a university in itself in terms of the deepness of what you learn and the experiences, there's always a sense that, you want to use that knowledge and you want to come back to your country of origin and utilize that there, to help your country. And I think for me, when I got that call from the headhunter, I said, well, I mean, that made a lot of sense. Go back to Panama, you help the country manage this pool of money. So that's basically how I made the jump. That's essentially how it happened.
Thank you. Very relatable, I think, topics there just around the benefit, the sort of intangible benefits of an MBA, the network that comes from that, and also that desire to take this learning and give back. And it does seem like an offer that would be hard to refuse, I think, to go back and be part of that sovereign wealth fund. And I'd love if you could take us on a brief journey now as to how that sovereign wealth fund developed, because it seems like it was almost like a startup at one point, and then now clearly it's mature, you could say, or at least in its adolescence. Can you just talk about what you kind of landed into once you accepted this role, what you had to work with, and how that's grown to this point?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So the board hired me, and what was not expected was that when I showed up, my first day on the job, if you will, there was really no office. There were no people, no computers. There was no infrastructure. There was nothing. I still remember that one of my board members said to me, well, as you can see, all we have is a stack of laws and rules and directives and nothing else. And so he said, look, why don't you just work out of the corner of this desk? I mean, I was not even given like a whole desk. It's like, I have a trading floor in my bank. You kind of set up shop there. So to your mention that this was a startup fund, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I do joke with people and tell them that this is the world's first startup sovereign fund because, we really started from zero. And fortunately, there was seed money. There was about $1.2 billion that was mainly in cash. So one of the first things was obviously try to hire a pretty strong assistant and create our investment policies and start investing the funds in higher yielding assets. I don't know if we're a teenager right now or kind of a young adult, but we're kind of like in the same, in that sort of area currently after 10, 11 years. But we have really moved the needle. We're about 2.8 billion right now, if you account for certain IOUs from the Panama Canal that the government is to give to us. And again, we went from plain vanilla cash to long bonds or longer bonds, equities. Was sort of phase one. And then phase two, we expanded on our alternatives program, going into private equity secondaries. That was an important transition for us. And then we're basically at the FAP and Fondo de Ahorro de Panama, just for the ease of explaining, we'll call it FAP. And then now we're in FAP 3.0, which is investing in infrastructure, private infrastructure, invested in private equity on the primary side, invested in private credit or private debt as well. That's sort of where we are in this transformation. And I think it's worth noting a couple of things. Why does the fund exist? The fund exists because it's essentially a rainy day vehicle. If the country gets into trouble because of natural disaster, this is a pool of funds that the country can tap to help in the immediacy of a natural disaster. Of course, we hope that these disasters are very long term. And so we invest in that way as well. We invest very long term and we invest outside of Panama because that allows us to be diversified from what happens economically in the country, because there's nothing worse than expecting to use the pool of money that's tied into an economy that's suffering, if that's the case at the moment. So one important thing I think is worth noting as well, the FAP is one of the few sovereign funds in the whole Latin America region and is modeled after other sovereign funds. The only exception is that the money that comes to the fund is not from oil revenues or mining revenues or any commodity like that. It is basically the Panama Canal. And what's interesting, and I think it's apropos with what's going on currently in the environment, is that essentially the FAP invests all the investments that it makes is in the U.S. market because obviously it's a market that we know very well, that is deep, that is very transparent. And see if you have any
Absolutely. No, that takes us through the evolution. I mean, quite a remarkable kind of a windfall to sit upon that at the first day if it's all invested in cash and go from there. And can you just give us a sketch your asset allocation today? And I suppose what's on your mind when you look at the investment opportunity landscape? Where are you going to allocate more, less? Bit of today's snapshot.
Sure. Yeah. We're modeled after an endowment fund in a lot of respects. Our equities portfolio, it's around 20% or so. Bonds are probably double that. And the rest is in a combination of cash and alternatives. An alternative for us is about 15%. So this brings up a question that if we're such a long-term fund, why do we have relatively small allocation to, say, equities at 20%? Well, number one, there are rules, and the rules limit us. And I think something that I think you would appreciate is there's the board appetite. What is the risk appetite for the board as to what it wants to take? And then sometimes that obviously acts as a governor in terms of where we want to go. Still, we do see a lot of opportunities in the private space. Some folks call it alternatives. I think, I've been saying now for about a couple of years that I don't think there's an alternatives allocation because alternatives are now traditional allocation. So I prefer to call it privates. So private markets, I think, is an area of a lot of attention and a lot of growth for us. And, and there, I think what we're looking for is participation on opportunities that are long-term, say infrastructure, and where cash flows are, again, visible into the distant future. So that's sort of our focus as to what we're looking at now.
And many other sovereign wealth funds have a focus maybe on local investment in the local economy. They take that to varying degrees. Some also have a sustainability overlay. Does any of that feature in your investment objectives and plan?
So the issue with internal investing, right, a sovereign fund that invests internally is very interesting because, as I said, we don't invest internally, but I think there's a strategic rationale for sovereign funds to invest internally. There's also I think, a social rationale as well, especially for countries with relatively new sovereign funds, which I think we would fall in that bucket. I think there's always a little bit of tension from citizens where they look at the sovereign fund and they say, okay, you're making great returns, and it's a lot of money, good ideas, great governance of the board, very transparent. But what does that mean for me as a citizen? Maybe I'm a taxi driver, a bus driver, or pharmacy worker. What does that sovereign fund means for me? So the underlying question there, I think, is there an opportunity for us specifically, and just your sovereign funds writ large, to look into the possibility of investing internally? And I think there is. And number one, you have to have clear rules about it because some of these amounts and some of these investments are pretty significant, especially for a small economy like ours. But also, what is the hook? What is it that you're trying to achieve? And I think one of the things that a sovereign fund could do when investing internally is investing in such a way that creates jobs and sustainable jobs, just to use that word again. It's not just building a building. It's about building infrastructure, maybe water infrastructure, water pipelines, perhaps ports, and these kinds of investments. So I'm not advocating for taking the sovereign fund, 100% of it, and bringing it to Panama to invest. What I'm saying is that there's room for a small portion of it to be invested because, again, I think that connects the citizens with this pool of money and what it means to them.
Well, absolutely. And I think that idea is that, of course, jobs and the sustainability is key. And you touched earlier on this in terms of governance. And you have a number of board roles, which I highlighted in the intro. And I'd love to just ask you in terms of the role that you play on these boards and what you seek to bring to them.
Sure. So I think there's an element of sexiness, if I may be able to use that word, about board roles. In my experience, having a board role, it's really hard work. Not only, but the time consumption, right? You have to be prepared on top of, you having to do your day job or whatever it is that you're doing, but also knowing what your role is not. And if you take a board role, you have to come in very clear-eyed that you're not there to run the company or the organization or the nonprofit or whatever it is. But your job, and I think this is what I bring, is about supporting the CEO or the executive director or the CIO, whatever the situation may be, in executing the mission. Again, going back to that military experience about teamwork, you're part of a team, but your relationship as a board member is a little bit different. You set out the mission, the overall strategy, the CEO or the executive director executes on that mission. And so when you're considering a board role, I think it's exactly just that. You have to be sort of a coach, a guide, or sounding board mixed in. And I think this is very important. All of that mixed in with a level of curiosity and I think healthy skepticism. A skepticism because while you're not going to demand a meeting with the accounting group to see the numbers, you do have to ask questions of the CEO about those numbers. I like to say, and this is not my quote, I've heard it somewhere, that the job of a board, it basically condenses into noses in, fingers out.
I've heard that before on this podcast, and I think that expresses it well. And also the curiosity. And I think thanks for highlighting the slog it involves too. I mean, there is a large commitment. And I think equally knowing the restraint of not meddling can be a challenging thing for executives to exercise. And in terms of governance best practice, I mean, one of the things you mentioned earlier, I think, was challenge and the need to kind of robustly, even working with getting the sovereign wealth fund off the ground, some of the challenge that was inherent in that with your board. I personally am concerned that governance is not getting better. Is actually, if anything, I think get more complex. It's getting looser. And that challenge is harder and harder to make, particularly as interactions are sometimes hybrid or virtual, and we don't have that personal relationship. Any observations? You work on such an array of organizations in terms of the direction of travel of governance. Are you optimistic or pessimistic at this point?
No, look, I mean, I'm optimistic, but I do share your concern and skepticism because it is hard. It is not like there is a handbook on how to be a board member. I think the closest thing is organizations like the NACD or others that do provide lots of guidance. There's sort of two areas that I think, and there are others, but there are two areas that I think are of concern. One is the accountancy of a firm. What is going into the numbers? That's a challenge because, like as I said, a board member is not going to go down to the third floor of the corporation and sit down with the accountant and look at receivables and none of these kinds of things. So I think that challenge with just the large amount of information and artificial intelligence and all these things to try to be more productive, that challenge I think is going to continue to be important. How you as a board member can be assured that what the numbers that are there are the actual numbers. I think that's always going to be a challenge. And I'd say the other sort of area that I think is of concern is crisis management. It seems like every 2 years, 3 years, there's a new type of crisis, right? So it used to be, if you're talking about a corporation, publicly traded corporation, you have the activist. That's a challenge that could turn into a crisis, could be an opportunity as well. But then now you have other types of activists that are just basically going after your company for X or Y reasons. They may or may not be shareholders. Social media has certainly accelerated that. So while, again, I do share your concerns about the skepticism, I think there are a lot of tools out there for board members to rely on. And I think one strategy for board members, I think, is to talk to other board members in other industries and see how they respond to things. I mean, I think you would find a pattern about how to respond to your particular situation. So it's not getting easier. It's getting harder, but I'm maybe a bit more optimistic.
Well, that's good to hear. And I'll certainly be relying on that, hopefully, as we look at more governance, just norms going forward. Love to now just conclude with some personal reflections. So you've had quite a journey from the military into doing an MBA and various types of business and now into a sovereign wealth fund. Any particular highs or lows or lessons learned from that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've I've had many, many setbacks. I mean, there are a lot, but I think, one in particular is just not getting a full-time job after an internship, right? That sort of stuff early in your career, has repercussions. But what's interesting about that particular experience is that I sort of felt and knew that I was not really pulling my weight, but yet I expected an offer, a full-time offer. That offer did not come. And I think how I sort of reason with that and ingrain that in the way that I move forward is kind of comparing it to an engine, not an electric engine, but like an old gas engine with 6 cylinders. And then it's about listening to your performance, listening that all 6 cylinders or 4 cylinders, whatever the case may be, are functioning at a good level. Maybe one is higher than the other, but if you notice, I think, and this is what happened to me, I noticed one of these cylinders not working properly. And I think that's the time to sort of stop and fix it. Whatever the case may be, maybe took too long. Maybe I took too long to respond to an email or emails, and that was a pattern. I knew that I was taking too long. I should have fixed it at the end. So in that particular situation, I did not listen to my performance, the cylinders, if you will. So I think that's one. I think another one, this is more on the finance side, if I may share it, is 2022. The year 2022 was a horrible year for asset managers. And there, I think it was when you have equities going down by 18 or 20%, and then you have bonds going down by 10, 12% at the same time, breaking the longstanding rule of diversification. That to me, and we suffered. I mean, the fund, I think its worst year was 2022. We closed the year something close to 8%, which is still, it wasn't as bad as others, but sometimes you cannot eat relative returns. You will still down. But I think what that situation, again, taught me, and I had never seen it before, was to beware of rules. They might work for a while, but you have to be on the lookout for opportunities or situations where they may not work.
Thank you for that humility, because I think so many people think it's all about a straight line trajectory in finance. And I think that the whole point of this podcast is to share some of those human stories and also the pivot that can happen when things don't work out as expected. And look at you now, I suppose, would be the evidence that things always work out in the end. But equally, that a setback along the way is not necessarily a hindrance. Quick question about mentors. Clearly, many of us have mentors, many don't. Did you have any particular mentor that was instrumental in your career?
I had several. I think not exactly mentor, but I think my mother would be sort of in that same bucket. At 73 again, I'm mentioning her age again. She's not going to be happy, but she instilled in me a strong sense of work ethic, just the grind of things. And I think that was important early on in my career, just to understand and to feel what that, and as you grow older, the rough patches, and you have to sort of pull through there as well. I'm happy to count as a mentor one of my board members who's been there since the very beginning, as a person that minces no words, points out things very constructively and directly in public and in private. And that, I think, is, at least for me, is very helpful, because I know I can count on this particular person to use as a sounding board. I'm going to present X, Y, and Z. I'm going to present this potential new investment. What do you think? And then that exercise allows me to be better prepared, anticipate questions, hear the truth, which might not be pleasant. But again, I think it creates a strong foundation for me to be prepared as I go.
Well, that sounds like a wonderful resource. And my last question is around any words of wisdom or creed or motto, whether it comes from Panama. And thank you for mentioning your mother, because many, many mothers and grandmothers, as well as fathers and grandfathers, come up in this podcast in this section. So it's remarkable just how much we take from them. Any creed or motto or piece of advice you can leave us with?
I think, my motto is not to be an asshole. I mean, I'm sorry if this is I don't know if this is a PG podcast, but that's important, because I think one of the things that I've heard since I was a younger person is that the world makes many turns, right? And sometimes, you find yourself on the top and sometimes you find yourself at the bottom. And, what that translates to is, if I get an email, say from an MBA student asking, and I finished my MBA about 20 years ago, asking a question, if I can take 5 minutes, I will, and I will answer the email. If I can't, I'll send the person to chat with someone else that has more relevant knowledge. But I think be sort of aware that people are at different stages and sometimes at developing stages. They may not have all the tools. And I think when I respond or when I try to be helpful, for me, at least, I think it's a gift that I think I'm providing that other person. It may not be the same exact answer. It may not mean or translate to a job, but I will at least give my advice of the one or two things that person can do. And hopefully, and I think this is the aim, is that person then reciprocates and provides another person in need with some guidance as well.
I love that. Well, we do like that life philosophy, certainly. I think in our world of finance, which can be a little cutthroat, I think more maybe need to be mindful of it. I'd also say, though, the world of sovereign wealth funds is remarkably representative of people with a similar philosophy. I think you are in a community of incredibly committed public servants who are not only operating with excellence in the world of investment, but also navigating a sometimes delicate path of local and world politics. So lots on your plate to juggle. Thank you so much, Abdiel, for coming here and for sharing your insights with us.
Thanks a lot, Ethan. Appreciate your help.
I'm Ethan Devitt. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear more inspiring investors and their personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organizations and affiliations of the host or any guest.